We started off this course by saying that our prayer for you, as you took this journey, was that you would be ambitious to have an ongoing relationship with the most persecuted as a result. And I like to characterize the relationship we have in this way. What they need, I give. What they learn, I need. And so it's the latter part of that we're concentrating on now, as we turn to our kind of final pillar, the spirituality of the persecuted church. What have persecuted Christians discovered about God that I must take into my own walk with God? And one way of understanding this is to talk of having three relationships. We have a faith boost, a faith challenge, and a faith model. Three ways in which we continue an ongoing relationship with the persecuted. Now, faith boost is the simplest. We see the stories, we read the stories, and they tell us of how God comes through for persecuted believers around the world who are living in the most extraordinary and challenging circumstances. These can be stories of amazing deliverances, stories of astonishing endurance. It doesn't matter if we can't relate, because it's the same God. They draw us in and they paint a picture of a strong and great God, our God too, as well as the God of the most persecuted. I remember once being a very discouraged preacher. Perhaps it was my unrealistic expectations. I was rather young. I was in my early 20s, and I was a pastor in a church that was largely full of Christians that were older than myself. And I felt very impervious to my preaching ministry. And I was in real deep despair for a while, until I received a faith boost in the story of a persecuted Christian called Brother Bao. And I encountered him in Vietnam. He was conscripted by the Khmer Rouge in 1966 when he was only 17, and he became totally dehumanized by the war. He saw his best friends shot, his girlfriend raped, then strangled. And to deal with these traumas, he chewed a jungle leaf prized for its narcotic qualities and would lapse into dreams of a perfect world and then waken to the hell of war. Well, one day, during this war, his troop ambushed a South Vietnamese patrol, and after a fierce skirmish, only one of the enemy survived, and they stood him up against a tree to be shot, and they gave him a last request. And the prisoner didn't request a cigarette, but he said, "Take this little book and read me a portion as I die." So Bao took the book and he began to read these words. "And Jesus said," and then he got no further, because suddenly the air was full of thunder and the trees around them were shredded with bullets, and he dived for cover, and he just managed to escape the destructive path of a helicopter gunship. In the melee, the prisoner actually escaped. But the next day, Bao asked his commander, he said, "Well, what did Jesus say?" And the commander looked shocked. And he said, "Well, look, it must have been something important for that man to want to hear it before he died." Well, the leader was furious, and he said he would report him to the political commissar. And Bao knew that he was in serious trouble. Anyway, on the march back, he was struck with rather painful diarrhea, and the troop waited by a tree for him to go a little distance into the jungle and relieve himself. And then there was this loud boom, and Bao returned to the tree to find all his companions hanging in bits from the foliage. They were all dead. And he continued as a soldier for 4 more years. He didn't tell anybody else of the experience, but every day, he said, I wondered what Jesus said. Finally, when he reached Saigon and his side was victorious, he found a Bible on the body of a dead soldier, and he covered it with brown paper, and he read it on the way back to Hanoi. And he said, I finally got to read what Jesus said. And I decided I wanted to die to those words too. But then he said, I was spared by God, even when I was in my sins. The diarrhea was what saved me. And that was God, in a sense. Otherwise, I would have been hanging in bits like the rest of my troop. But God wanted to save me, and he spared me to hear what Jesus had to say. Now, for me, that's a great testimony to the power of God and the power of his word, to intrigue Bao for 4 long years with just that little phrase, and Jesus said. So I took that story into my own preaching ministry. It reminded me of what preaching really is. It's speaking words that God takes, sears them into someone's brain and heart, and then preserves that life so that they can live by these words. And how little the actual preacher has to do with that process. That's what's so humbling about it. I used to think preaching was about how well I spoke or how clever my material was. But as a result of that story, I see what God really does through the words that come from my mouth. And that blows me away. So that's the idea of a faith boost. I don't get so discouraged now when I preach. And there are hundreds, thousands of stories in which we nourish our own faith and we get our own canvas stretched out to see God for the true size that he is. And of course, our cultures and societies need to hear these testimonies and stories too. There was some research done years ago about the spirituality in Western nations. And interestingly, it concluded that the primary reason that most people no longer believe in God or go to church is because they cannot square the idea of an all-powerful God of love with all the suffering in the universe. It's not atheism that's the primary reason, or the belief that science has explained the religious away. It's the question of what theologians call theodicy. God can't be real or powerful if he allows all this suffering to go on in the world. That's mostly the reason why people in the West do not have an active faith. But that's exactly the question the testimonies of the persecuted are facing head on. These individuals have experienced terrible suffering. They have gone to the far side of grief, and they still come back and say, God is good. And the point is, you can't discount the story. It's real, it's gritty, it's authentic. And if you add that to the message, we might be able to speak to the culture rather than just past it. This is a great gift. Faith boost. What a relationship.